Well, I'm Dr. Evie Powell. I'm an engineering manager and virtual reality architect for Proprio. I drive the engineering team in the development of holistic experiences for surgical teams using Proprio solutions.
And I'm Sam Brown. I'm a practicing pediatric neurosurgeon in Seattle at the University of Washington. I'm also the Chief Medical Officer at Proprio and one of the co-founders of the company. So we're excited to talk to you today about the technology that we're working on and talk about super surgeons. So quickly, disclaimer, we're going to be talking about various technologies that we're working on throughout the talk today.
Awesome. So our talk today is centered around the idea of a super surgeon. It's kind of like the medical systems equivalent of like an intelligence explosion, where information in the future becomes so seamlessly and irrevocably integrated into medical care that the users involved seem also almost superhuman. And so you're going to hear this idea a lot. I'm here to tell you about what that means to us. And so I guess I'll start with sort of our approach to it, which is using a lot of thoughts from quantitative research methodology. The world is a series of bell curves. So whenever you're trying to get to the bottom of a social phenomena, who gets accepted in Ivy League schools, the best of the best among college athletes and professional athletes, and things like internships, hiring rates, you'll notice that there's usually a bell curve or a normal distribution where of the performers, most people fall in the middle, but you have a select few that are overachievers and a select few that are underachievers. And so when we think about our super surgeon, we usually sort of start at the beginning of who are our top performers of today and what sets them apart. And usually you'll find that there are four buckets or categories in which their abilities fall. So what sets them up for success and distinguishes them? Some of it being innate ability, some is opportunity or access, some of it is training, and some of it's just repetition and how they hone their skill. But before we get into that, I should probably step back and let's talk about why a super surgeon is actually important.
So one of the things that we look at is what's happening in the world with the growing population. So as we look at the population that's 65 and older, right now it's about 54 million in the United States. These are the folks who are predominantly using a lot of the surgical access in the United States. And it's projected that this population alone in the US is going to grow significantly over the next 10 years. One of the challenges that we face is that there's going to be a projected shortage of surgeons over that same time frame. So we have an increasing number of patients who are going to need surgery and less surgeons to perform that operation. And so the question that we're looking to address, amongst many things, is how do we enable those surgeons to have better capacity and to expand knowledge base amongst surgeons so that they can all perform at a very high level, whether that's in the US or around the world. And if you look at active surgeons who are currently practicing, a significant number of these surgeons are going to age out over the next several years. So 2 out of 5 surgeons right now are 65 years of age or older, and so their longevity in practice is only the next few years potentially before they retire. So we have this compounded problem of increasing population, increasing need for surgery, but the potential of less surgeons to actually provide that care.
So, I mean, it's pretty clear that one of the reasons we care about super surgeons and our surgeon of tomorrow is because we need those surgeons today. So when we talk about super surgeons, we're usually talking about not necessarily the best among the best that exist today. We're using those as a reference and a way to shape our theories and principles for design so that we can craft the next generation of surgeons. And these are surgeons that we can't even imagine question what they're capable of, because we haven't seen that integration of technology and brain power just be that seamless. So,
a quick comment on this too. So, as we train residents and fellows in neurosurgery, for example, these 4 key components, and Evie's going to talk a lot about this as we think about the evolution and integration of technology in the operating room. Innate ability, we see people come through who you just think are gifted. They have very good hands. They clearly understand sort of the mechanics of operating. And then there's others in this arc that are not as gifted with their hands. So there's innate ability for people who are coming to be a surgeon. We talk about opportunity, which is really key. So did you get to go to a good residency training program? Did you have good mentors? Was it a high volume practice where you got to see a lot of different surgeries, different type of pathologies? Because it's experiential learning that we talk about. It's one-to-one, it's mentorship, and this has been what's going on for the last 100 years of surgery. It's an apprenticeship right now. Training, as we mentioned, is really key. Like, where did you go to train? There are great training programs and there are lesser quality training programs, and that directly impacts, at least when you start out in practice, how good a surgeon you are. Again, repetition. It's a learned art, right? You learn by doing, we say, and the more cases you see, the more complexity of the pathology. When there's an adverse outcome, did you see why that happened, and can you learn from that so that doesn't happen again or to you in practice? So there's a lot that goes into making of a surgeon, and a lot of that is based on time and presence and where they're at and where they're learning, and so we think we can impact that learning curve.
Right. And so you'll notice that a lot of these things and these principles are sort of core to the user. But there's technology that assists, that actually changes where people fall in these distributions. And ultimately, over time, it's technology that actually, it's technology and knowledge and our knowledge base that shifts that curve so that the next generation of people just tend to outperform the previous generation. But technology has to be done in the right way. So I like to use this example. This is Dick Fosbury, very well known for the Fosbury flop, sort of the way we think about high jumps today. But if we look at him and we look at this snapshot of just him being airborne and essentially flying, we're not thinking about all of the things that led up to that point. We're not thinking about, like, what shoes he's wearing and how his tracksuit is optimal for analyzing his form while he's practicing. We're not thinking about, like, just the amount of repetition and the amount of training he did in order to achieve this. He's airborne, so he's not recounting all of that stuff. He's got 5 seconds to really, put together what his execution plan is. And it's actually pretty interesting to think about, where is he looking? What are the information streams that are important for him in those 5 seconds where he's up there? And this is the way I like to actually approach technology, is that when we lead a person up into the operating room, there's tons of technology that's available, but they really have that sort of window of time of them having the patient open on the table and operating to actually determine what sources of information are important, what sources of information are noise, and how does this all come together to me essentially flying, and then how do I get down, and how do I make this repeatable so that I can do it over and over again. So technology, when we think about it, is supposed to be as invisible as the technology that you are seeing and when you see this picture. All right.
So as we start to talk about super surgeons, I think it's interesting to kind of look back historically at what the operating room looks like, what it's evolved to, and where we think the future is going to lead. So these are some pictures that we found from the 1900s. What you see here is there's a patient or a cadaver that the surgeons are around, and everybody's leaning in to try and get a view, right? So again, this is the one-to-one apprenticeship. If you're in the top row, you're probably not able to see very well. And so that transfer of information, that transfer of knowledge is challenging. Kind of fast forward to 70s and 80s, there's certainly more equipment, more technology brought in, better lighting. But the same general premise applies, is that there's the surgeon, there's somebody that they're training, there's somebody assisting, and they're around the patient. If you're outside of that kind of microcosm, it's very challenging to see or learn what's going on. And then this is the modern operating room of today. Certainly some increase in technology, and one thing I would have you look at is that there are monitors everywhere, and they're away from the patient. So when I'm operating, my focus should be just on that patient. I should be in the moment. When I'm looking for data that's going to inform how I'm operating, to stand up and look away from the patient or even walk away from the patient and go through an MRI CT is not the way we should be doing things today. And I think a really important piece of what's informed where we're at in terms of surgical capabilities today is information that's garnered ahead of the operation. So we've gone from x-rays to, within neurosurgery, it was a fundamental breakthrough to be able to do pneumoencephalography, do lumbar puncture, inject air, turn the patient upside down, try and get the air up in the ventricle, and then you can see at least some idea that there's a tumor. So that's evolved now to CTs, which obviously revolutionized our ability to see anatomy, to MRIs. And the one thing I would tell you is that MRIs and a lot of the imaging modalities we use today are very dense technologies. There's a lot of information there, and we're really only using a small component of that most times in the operating room. We may look at orthogonal planes and look at where a tumor is, for example, but to be able to bring that dense data to the patient while we're operating, it really isn't effectively transferred at this moment. And so this is where we're looking to bring data in many, many locations that are surrounding the patient to the focus of the operation.
Right. So you can see from those images, and as Dr. Broad was saying earlier, is that this information, it's additive right now. And so we see these incremental changes. You get more data streams, more technology, and it's spread all over the OR. And this can actually lead to something sort of counterproductive. So as you introduce all of these disparate streams, there's more effort that's taken to actually assess, what this information means, how it's important to what you're doing, the context of what you're doing, what information is noise at the moment, so you should disregard it. And what you do is you increase the cognitive load, and that's actually the exact opposite of what you want. And so when we think about our design principles, we're actually looking to do the inverse of that. How can you actually bring the focus, bring the attention into the patient, into the context of what the surgeon is actively doing at the time, and how are they processing this information and how are they interpreting it? Because if you have technology that is increasing the amount that of processing they have to do, an advanced surgeon will ignore it. Like if it's not immediately relevant, we do this all the time. So this is a concern for us.
So just as an example, wanted to illustrate where cognitive load happens in the operating room. So for the nurses, a lot of their cognitive loads at the beginning of the case, again, the patient in the room, situated, drops off actually while we're doing the case, and then as they prepare the patient to leave, it goes back up. This is the surgical technologist. Obviously, their workload increases in the core part of the case. But what's interesting, again, is as the surgeon, the beginning of the case, the preparation of the patient, how they're getting intubated, positioned, the opening is a low-stress activity, generally speaking. The cognitive load in the ramp is really going to be the case. So if I'm taking out a brain tumor, it's really for that hour and a half that we're right in the midst of this, trying to problem solve as we're encountering different anatomy or there's bleeding. The cognitive load is very high. And so what you're trained to do is focus only on that problem, and everything else kind of just disappears. And so the cognitive load is very high, and if you can bring relevant information to the surgeon in that moment that's practical and useful, that's actually really important. And so right now, if I want to reference an MRI scan or do something like that, In the middle of a case, I'm stepping away, I'm having somebody scroll through the screens for navigation in the operating room, similar looking away from the patient to try and navigate. So there's opportunities to reduce the cognitive load and the stress of surgery and make that surgeon a higher performer in that moment.
Yeah. So now that we've sort of set up the problem statement, this clearly isn't working today because the technology that's surrounding them isn't working in consideration of the patient or the environment. The information becomes harder to access, harder to interpret and analyze, and we want to actually figure out how can we resolve the surgeon struggles today to create these super surgeons of tomorrow. So how do we address the technological challenges that are happening today, and then how can we be forward thinking about what actually might help them in the future? Because as I said before, we want that technology to be essentially invisible, and we want to use that technology to launch our surgeons to heights that they've never dreamed of before. So now let's go back to our 4 characteristics and sort of deep dive into each of these things. Innate ability. This one's fun. I'm going to enjoy talking about this one. But opportunity, I tend to think of this as access to resources, access to mentors, access to opportunities to train. Training, what does that education look like? How do you establish training environments that are real enough for and high fidelity enough to actually embody the actual OR? And then how do we actually cause efficient repetition, and then how do we take those years of training and years of owning a skill and turning it into something that we can pass on to future generations, because that passing on of knowledge is going to be important. So I'll break it down. We'll start with the one that's the hardest to interpret and the hardest to influence. So sometimes innate ability is transferable and sometimes it's not. But it's clear that innate ability is sometimes used as to categorize behavior and attributes that we don't quite understand. But nonetheless, it's actually a pretty good starting point for evaluating the mindset and the internal map of our current overachievers. And so we've seen technology attempt to transfer innate ability through things like synesthesia. And these are goals and principles that we have. Because we want to actually figure out what does mastery mean, what does mastery mean to our super and overachievers, and how can we actually use those things that start out seeming like magic and provide that to other people that might think and operate differently. So here you can see this is sort of a snapshot of one of our experienced surgeons. And so at the top row you can see that they placed several screws in the thoracic region of the spine, and the teal represents the target or the ideal planned location, and then the orange screw represents where they actually placed it. And then at the bottom, you can see that they were using our Proprio image-guided system, and you can see that there's a very clear difference. But before I go into that, let's first actually take the time to appreciate that this is with no technology, the top row, and it's pretty good. So if we can actually understand what a surgeon is actually thinking, how do they do that? If you're only seeing the top of the spine, how do you actually figure out where to place this screw? And this is due to their knowledge of the anatomy, and it's due to haptic information that they're using from their instruments. And so you can see that there was a lot for us to learn and to draw from so that we could develop a solution that could make him even better. Because as you can see, even the best of the best among surgeons have the capability of doing even better with the right technology.
So I'm going to go back to this for a half second, just make a quick comment if I can. So when an orthopedic surgeon or neurosurgeon is placing a screw, you have millimeter tolerances to put that screw in. So you're looking, after you have opened up, at the bony anatomy, and you've learned where's the appropriate entry point to start that screw. And you have in your mind the angle that you want to achieve to drive that screw down. If you're off and you're too medial, you're going to put it into the spinal cord. If you go too deep, you're going to put it potentially into the aorta or another structure. If you're too lateral, you're going to put it into a nerve root, and they may have a motor deficit or a sensory deficit. Or they may need to have a repeat operation because the screw's misplaced, which increases the cost and of the stay, but more importantly, the outcome of the patient's impacted. And so while the majority of surgery is done freehand now, what we're working on is technologies that bring the imaging, the guidance, and navigation to the surgeon in the moment so that they can benefit from the technology to more accurately perform the surgery. That's the goal that we're working toward. So, as Evie alluded to, we brought in one of my colleagues at the University of Washington. Dr. Saigal is a fellowship-trained spine neurosurgeon, meaning he did 7 years of neurosurgery, did an extra year of fellowship to learn how to do that specific practice, and he probably does about 250 spine operations a year. So he puts in probably thousands of screws in a given year. Very capable, excellent surgeon. So we were interested in how can we bring technology to him that improves his practice in some way. So he's a very efficient guy, and he gets through the case in a reasonable amount of time safely. But when we brought the technology and had him utilize it, what we found was that we can improve for him with the technology where his entry point is going to be. And then also with the angulation areas. So we're going against what is an expected trajectory, an idealized trajectory, and how does he match up against it? So this is early work that we did in the design phase and study phase of the work that we're doing. And so important to workflow and the surgeon experience. If it takes longer, if there's extra steps, nobody's going to adopt the technology. But you want something that works within the workflow of the surgeon and improves some capability that they have to either be faster doing the surgery, they can be safer doing the surgery. Those are important things that we're trying to target with what we're doing.
Yeah. So, so when thinking about innate ability, one of our biggest things and biggest challenges as designers of technology that empowers surgeons is that we want to be able to give them the ability to have those inputs and those data streams that our top surgeons have. So if they're using information that is coming from their tools, how can we reroute that? How can we turn that into a visual cue for the next person that's actually using our system? Those types of practices are going to be key towards creating a system that actually changes what that distribution is for the next generation. So next up, I'll talk about opportunity. It's probably no shock to anyone here that it takes a lot of time and resources to make a good surgeon. We're just scratching the surface as to why that is. But a lot of it comes down to the access to data, access to high fidelity practicing environments, access to mentors. All of that's going to be super critical for the super surgeons of tomorrow that are going to demand having access to learn and train from the best minds, to easily share their findings with their peers, to iterate on new ideas and better ideas and finding them faster than the previous generation. So it all comes down to access to information and mind share.
So a comment on opportunity. So you're only as good as the experience that you had in your training program and the people who teach you. And so, we talk about these distributed curves, whether it's in the United States or around the world, there are excellent training facilities and you get that experience. You have that mentorship of that expert. And we talk a lot in surgery about surgical pearls. What are those things that make that one person the world expert or the best surgeon? Well, that's come because they've had opportunity to operate on a lot of people. They've seen a lot of pathology. They've gotten themselves out of trouble innumerable times during an operation. And the opportunity for us as learners is to get in front of that person and we remain doing an apprenticeship. So it's very hard to scale transfer of knowledge in surgery because it's a one-off. I need to be physically present. I need to be bellied up to the bar, right up against the patient, seeing what's happening, to be able to learn and to learn those nuances. And then I transfer that. In my practice, I've trained 15 fellows, so that's okay, but that really doesn't scale appropriately. And as we talk about this lack of surgeons that is going to be an increasing problem, how do we scale and improve that transfer of knowledge, and what makes an expert an expert?
So, as I mentioned earlier, a lot of that is going to be access to that information, and key to that is our light field technology. And so you'll notice that in our system, one of the things that we introduce is a light field capture, and this is happening in real time. Essentially what this gives us is not just a light field or a light intensity map of what's going on, which is what you would see in a standard video, but you're also capturing information about the light's direction. What this means to the end user is that not only can you see it from the perspective of the original capture, but you can also see it from various other perspectives. This is great for our virtual reality and immersive solutions because it essentially allows you to see from whatever perspective you need rather than whatever perspective was captured. So if you want to see from the perspective of the surgeon and play back this information or stream it to someone that's across the world at the time of the actual surgery, this empowers you to do it. So low cost and high fidelity information that gives you that kind of flexibility for you to not only work in person but also work remotely. This is going to be key towards giving people those opportunities for success, giving them that opportunity to have the data that they need.
Quick comment on this too. So in the current state, we can capture two-dimensional video data in the operating room. There are a few technologies where there's some ability to get some three-dimensional video, but it's very hard to capture, archive, share that information in a meaningful and useful way. And so by capturing a three-dimensional data set longitudinally over the operation, not only can we archive and start to learn from that data, but we can share that data within the operating room with colleagues anywhere around the world. So we think it's going to really transform the way that data is not only acquired in the operating room, but the opportunities around that, both from a learning perspective, big data opportunity, but also from a telemedicine, telesurgery perspective of how we're engaging with trainees and colleagues around the world.
All right. So, let's see. All right. And so, once it's determined something can be taught and the information can be shared, then the question becomes, how do you train them? And so we already know that our top performers, they train harder, they train deeply, they train smartly. As my past research suggests in sort of the world of gaming, they train for fun. They don't train just, when they're researching or studying. They train, while they're at home just hanging out. And so I won't go into the details of that for this talk, but it does sort of surface that training, access to educational resources, and drive to train are going to be things that actually distinguishing our achievers over the average. Some of these trainings can be limited by things like the mentorship that we mentioned earlier. Sometimes it's due to resources, but sometimes it's due to lack of space.
So I'm going to talk briefly about this too. So one of the challenges with training, so take neurosurgery for example, it's a 7-year training program around the United States. Now it's uniformly applied 7 years. The first couple years you're a junior resident, you maybe help open the case, but the main crux to the procedure, whether you're doing the spine instrumentation or you're taking the tumor out, is done by the senior resident and the attending. So those are the last 2 years of your education. So you spent 7 years sort of on the periphery of the surgery, only to have the last 2 where you're actually deeply involved in what we call the critical portion of the case. So if you look at scenes like this, there's an operation going on. There's 2 or 3 people who can see what's going on. They're actively involved in the performance of the operation. There's people around watching, trying to get a glimpse of it, or they're watching on typically a 2D screen of operative, video coming off the microscope. And then all these other people are coming from wherever to try and learn from that expert. So the transfer of knowledge is really very challenging. And in a very good training program in the United States, a senior resident graduating may operate on 2,500 patients over the course of their entire residency. And then they're qualified to go hang a shingle and operate on you. But if you really look at those 2,500 cases, how many were they actually deeply involved in that surgery? And we also train on live people, which I think is an interesting concept, right? So we both flew here yesterday, and the pilot who took us here has had thousands of hours in a flight simulator before they ever sit in that jump seat. My trainees, the first time they operate is on like your mom or your dad or on me or whatever it may be. And so we don't take advantage of the opportunity to bring technology to training. And historically, we've done cadaveric work and things of this nature to get that non-live training opportunity. It's super challenging to do that, very hard to scale. And so we think opportunities around technology in education and simulation and training are where the future of all this is going, similar to what we see in other industries.
Yeah.
So I commented on this briefly, but this is a little bit of my journey. So, I graduated, I'm getting old. So I graduated college in 89, 90, went to medical school, did a PhD around that time too, and then I started neurosurgery training in 2000. Finished in 2007, did a year of pediatric focused specialty training. And what I tell everybody who comes through our training program is that that's great, but you're really not done. And there's a very steep learning curve that happens when you go into independent practice for the first 5+ years, where it's your nickel, you're operating, you're figuring out what you're good at, where you have challenges or complications, and adjust to that. So it is a multi-year journey to go from uninitiated and entering medical school through whatever surgical specialty you're going to do to get to the point of what I would call true competency. So how do we take technology and shorten that or inform that time period? Because it's really not scalable. And my useful practice life, once I'm done, is maybe 25 years potentially, and maybe I'm going to touch 8,000 or 9,000 patients in a busy neurosurgery lifetime of practice.
Yeah. So yeah, I'd say what's fun about what I get to do at Proprio is I can really very clearly see the potential for the ability to train in a very embodied, realistic environment where I have access to the collection of the best and the brightest of surgical minds that are standing right there with me to lead me towards a path to success. Now, I will not say that I am a surgeon or that I'm trained in any way, but
You're pretty good.
I will admit I'm pretty good. But I would say that it's opportunities like this that so to even the playing field, giving people that opportunity to practice it in an embodied and simulated and realistic environment, being able to compare them against models of what success and what super achieving and what mastery looks like. Being able to track mastery over time, those are going to be things that actually change that distribution so that the next generation is just much more capable of anything we've seen today. And then last up on our list is repetition. So we've talked about how when and how you study is really important. Who and you're studying with is also important as well, because these are people that you want to train from that have had years of knowledge that they've accrued over the years, and you don't want to lose that just because someone ages out. So being able to track success, track when different operations and procedure styles and techniques actually work well for different problem sets. That's going to be very, very important towards distinguishing this next generation of surgeons.
So when I think about repetition, I think about how many laps around the track has that surgeon done or that trainee, right? Like how many microdiscectomies have they done? How many brain tumors have they done? So we categorize all this stuff in training, but where it really comes apparent to me is when I talk to a family. So, I'll go in the room, and this happens a little less as my hair has gotten more gray over the years, but the families go, how many have you done? Right? That's a common question that you get as a surgeon. How many of these have you done? What's your experience with this? Repetition matters for many reasons. It matters from the acquisition of just the skill set of operating. How many times have you used your hands? How many knots have you thrown? Have you used 10-0 suture, which is finer than human hair? It's really not easy to operate, and that is a learned skill that comes through repetition over time. It's a manual learned muscle memory, et cetera. Just like Tiger Woods has taken millions of golf swings to become who he is, that gifted surgeon has taken many, many laps around the track and has that muscle memory and skill. But it's also the knowledge that's acquired with repetition. And so we use this gentleman as an example. He operated until he was in his 80s. And on this graphic that we have, reportedly, he did 50,000 operations. I can't even fathom that concept. But one of the things that we're trying to work toward is, as we capture this data in the operating room, how do we take the knowledge that this gentleman has gained over 50,000 operations and extract from that what has value to take to that surgeon or that trainee who's done 5 cases? How do you take those pearls of wisdom that come with years of experience and the trials and tribulations and all the skeletons that are in your closet as a surgeon of patients who've had bad outcomes that you learn from so that that doesn't happen again? How do you take that information that is lost when this guy retires and dies and doesn't have the ability to transfer it anymore? How do you capture that? And so we think that the digitization of the operating room and the visual stream in surgery will allow these type of data collection and analysis to occur so that we can then inform surgeons during surgery. Hey, maybe you're going a little bit to the left and you're going a little close to the carotid artery, maybe you should come back to the middle. Or maybe that screw placement isn't quite right. Or something that informs them that the pearls that this gentleman acquired over decades and thousands of patients, how do you transfer that to the next generation of surgeons, whether that's in the US or maybe it's in Kathmandu? That's where we want to go.
Yeah. So we've gone over a lot of ideas, and we've talked about how we can use things like machine learning, neural networks, virtual reality, a very large amount of technology to actually change the way we operate. But the technology has been growing outside of the OR for a very long time. And so why haven't we seen as much of the innovation in immersive technologies, machine learning, robotics, that you can actually use in the OR today? Why is it growing in spaces outside of it versus internal to the medical field? And I think I have some of the reasons for that. For that matter, like there's things that we use every day, blockchain, there's distributed computing, 5G, like why don't we see any of this stuff? I think that ultimately what it comes down to are magic moments. It's imperative that we keep the focus on the patient, keep the focus on the task, because when you don't, you end up with things that feel like gimmicks. I had the pleasure of working at Xbox for a couple of years on the speech team. I worked on the natural user interfaces for the Xbox. It was a fantastic experience. And we did create a lot of those magic moments, but they were not where I originally thought they were. So if you have an Xbox Connect, you may not, use your Connect every day for some of the things like, skeletal, physical boxing video game, or a game where you're speaking to a virtual agent or something like that in the video game. You see those magic moments in areas where the technology sort of fades into the background. Facial recognition is something that was a magic moment for the Xbox, where essentially you sit down and it knows who you are and it logs you in with all of your user information. And you don't have to do anything to do that or enable that. It just happens because it sees who you are and it assesses that you're the person that's wanting to play this video game. And so that's what we look for when we're looking for technology, and when is the right time to bring it in. Is it something that allows a person to connect less with the technology and the data stream and more to what's underneath? Like, does it actually create a transparent layer to a solution that they're looking for? That's what we want.
So in the last couple minutes here, we're going to show you a little bit about what we're working on and how we think the solution to some of these challenges will be addressed in the operating room. So we've talked a lot about this. Where's the surgical team? Where should they be focused? And where are people looking for information? So this woman here doesn't know how to wear a mask in the operating room, is looking away from the patient. This is not what we want. We want people focused on the surgery, where the action is, and not distracted and overwhelmed with information that's not relevant. So we think that there's a new way of seeing in the operating room, and this is the technology that we're working on now.
Yeah. So instead of scenarios like this where there's either distraction or there's information that's not focused on the patient, instead of that, we should have experiences where the information is integrated and focused on the patient and contextually relevant. Instead of crowded ORs that put the patient at risk because people are trying to learn or to teach, instead, what if we had solutions where a person could beam in from wherever they are? They could be halfway across the world and still give you information or still allow you to see and engage with a surgery that you might be trying to learn from. This is a fun picture from a demo that we did where we did exactly that. Yeah.
So again, the question is, how do you develop super surgeons? So a super surgeon, again, is somebody who embodies those 4 traits that we talked about. How do you scale this knowledge, distribute this knowledge, and make people perform at their best at any given time in any given place, whether they've had the opportunity to train in the best center or not? So this is an example of myself in the headset. So this is a virtual reality headset. What you see here is a rendering of that patient's individual vertebral body. We have placed a trajectory that we want for the ideal screw placement, and then as the surgeon in the case, I see the trajectory. I can align up to that surgery or that surgical trajectory and place that screw. So there's a lot of things going on to actually place that screw safely. Where's the entry point? Where's the target? How are you drilling? Are you going too medial, as we talked about, getting toward critical structures or away? Can I lean in and peel away that anatomy so I get a view inside of the body? So it's this ability to create almost X-ray vision, which has been one of the holy grails in medical imaging, and how that's brought to the operating room and operative environment. And what information is presented? I just want what I need to do that surgery safely and efficiently. I don't need a million things, as Evie's talked about, that's overload, that increases my cognitive load in the moment when I need to do the critical portion of the case. So this is the way we're thinking about surgery now, is bringing that information to the surgeon in the moment in a way that's digestible and useful.
Yeah. One of the things you'll notice here is that headset. Some people ask, like, why is it not an augmented reality headset? Things of that nature. But it all feeds into this idea that we have about being able to modulate the reality and turn it into what you need and when you need it. So we talked about earlier how the light field allows us to capture that information of the surgical site from any perspective. But at certain parts of the surgery, really what you want to know is where is that pedicle bone and am I breaching it and going outside of the boundaries of where I need to go. So our UI is built to be very simplistic like that, to not only give you information, but to strip information away. So here you can see that we're allowing a surgeon to sort of have a cutaway view from any perspective and be able to see that internal structure of that pedicle bone, like where that canal, where are they supposed to actually place their tool in real time. And so that's sort of the core of our design principles. And it's all powered by this system that we call Paradigm. And so all of the technologies that we've talked about, including the robotic solutions, the immersive reality component, and the light field capture, and all of that stuff is really focused on this key hardware. Coming soon to an OR near you.
So one of the things I want to comment on is there's an interesting moment in time where all of these emerging technologies have happened outside the operating room, and how, as Evie was saying, do we bring these into the operating room and make them most effective? And so partners for ProPro include Intel, HTC, NVIDIA, Samsung, and the idea here is, can you bring these bleeding edge technologies, integrate them in a way that allows you to operate and achieve that super surgeon status, capture that data, analyze the data, share that data. It's the idea of transforming the operating room from an analog to a fully digital environment, and being able to understand, use, and analyze the visual information that is so deep and so robust that we're only transferring now on a one-off basis. So there's multiple components to what we're doing, from the performance of surgery and improving the ability to do that, to data acquisition and capture that will cover training, simulation, and analysis in a variety of different ways. So it's a big, big play to try and digitize the operating room.
And we're just getting started. So in order to create that super surgeon, it's a lot about what we've built today, but it's also about our approach to how we influence and prioritize technology tomorrow. So today's technologies are tomorrow's inspiration. And we're excited about how virtual reality, machine learning, computer vision can directly impact the future of surgery if it's done in a way that keeps the focus in the right places and keeps the context of the interactions as the key towards driving these solutions.
And I'll end with this comment. So we went through 4 basic principles of what makes a surgeon, and everybody in this room has a pretty high likelihood at some point in their life that you're going to have a surgery, whether that's in 10 years, next year, and guaranteed there's somebody in this hall that's going to have surgery for some reason tomorrow. Just the odds are of that happening. When you have surgery or your loved one has surgery, you want that surgeon to be functioning at their highest capability in that moment, on that day, and have available to them the best technology to impact their performance. And no matter where that happens in the United States or around the world, that's the goal of what we're trying to do, is create super surgeons so that when it's you or your family member having surgery, the very best outcome can occur from that operative event. So thank you very much. Happy to take any questions.
Yeah.